Austin, if there are no more people in the waiting room, do you want to start with the technical introduction?
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and maybe also good night for many parts of other people from the world. Welcome again to this session that we are going to have on looking at UCP in the digital age, but this session will focus on decolonizing UCP and accompaniment. But before we start, I would like to give the word to Jan and Austin for some technical housekeeping so that this session can run smoothly and to tell us how do we approach it from a technical point of view. Austin.
Thank you very much, Rosemary, and hello and welcome to everyone. Interpretation services are available in this workshop. Please select the language in which you would like to hear this session. Those options can be accessed by selecting the interpretation button along the bottom of your Zoom window next to the globe icon. And this instruction also applies to English speakers. If you're most comfortable speaking and listening in English, select English. For all languages, please select the language you are most comfortable using. I'll be providing technical support during this session. This session is being recorded and the recording will be shared on the Lumio discussion site. If you do not want your video to be shared, you can turn off your video by selecting the Stop Video button in the lower left corner. Since the session is being recorded, only communicate information that you're comfortable sharing publicly. When you're not speaking, please select the mute button in the lower left corner. This will mute your audio to help preserve audio quality. Then you can select unmute to provide audio when you are speaking. Please ensure that your name displayed on Zoom is accurate. To change your Zoom name, you can click the three dots in the upper right corner of your display and select rename. Please use the raise hand feature in the reactions tab to be called on to make a comment or ask a question. If you do not see this feature, feel free to reach out to me directly over chat. Make sure that you send the chat to me specifically instead of to the entire group. You may also reach out with any other technical questions throughout the workshop, and I wish you all an excellent session.
Thanks, Austin. And I don't think I introduced myself. My name is Rosemary Okello-Lale. I work at Strathmore University Business School as the director of the African Media Hub, and I'll be facilitating this session with Professor Brerit. And just to turn to this session of an armed civilian protection and accompaniment in the digital age, before we go into it, I'd like to remind us that UCP has been a key issue that even the Security Council approved it in Resolution 2327. And during that time, the Council authorized the UN mission in South Sudan to use all necessary means to protect civilians. Meanwhile, scant attention has been given to unarmed methods of the protection of civilians and also is inherently sustaining of peace. So in this Zoom session, we'll learn from experts who are here with us on both the opportunities and the risk of modern methodologies in UCP accompaniment. This session also is preceded by a discussion, broad thread in which we can share examples of technology used in our work and pose both positive and negative and pose any specific concern. And I'd like to just bring to your attention that experts who have actually been implementing UCP in the various continents are here with us. So we are so lucky to have them. So we look at how we can actually discuss all use of digital technology all the time, be it mobile phones or our computers, how modern technologies can provide greater opportunities to enhance UCP and accompaniment practice. Also, how examples that will be given will showcase real-time analysis during ongoing violent and violence-prone events. And also we will hear from two examples from Kenya and the US today where technologies have been used in such beneficial. So at the same time, however, we'll also, we are at risk that emerge from this widespread technology. We have all heard of cyber attacks and data hackings, and some of the organizations represented here today may even have experienced such threats. So in just one case, just cyber threats, We learned from how people have been able to manage it, how they have been able to make themselves safer. Therefore, it's vital for UCP and accompaniment actors to consider digital age threats across the cyber sphere as they carry their work. So to start us off in addressing this, I'd like now to invite our speakers and my co-facilitator, Berit, to take us through to the next session. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Rosemary, for kicking us off there. We were supposed to have 5 speakers today, so if you look into the agenda, but unfortunately, Dennis Ogonji can't make it today. But anyone else of the speakers who has actually experience of using digital technologies in response to violence in Kenya is very welcome. I know there are people here who will speak who have experience in that. You're very welcome to speak to that as well. So our first session is then where we want to focus on kind of what possibilities and what benefits the use of technologies can bring to unarmed civilian protection and accompaniment. And we have 2 speakers to this effect, Brendan O'Hanrahan and Eli McCarthy, who I'm going to introduce briefly. Brendan is an ecologist, a crisis mapper, a media monitor, and a community land use activist. Since September 2020, he set up and has since run the operational side of Political Incident Reporting USA, which constitutes the media monitoring and remote early warning arm of the Trust Network, which is an alliance of peace building and mediation organizations, which has been set up to tackle political violence and threats to democracy in the US in the autumn of 2020. Eli McCarthy, in turn, is the director of DC Peace Team, deploying UCP units and offering training in unarmed civilian protection, nonviolent communication, restorative justice, bystander intervention, and mediation. So the DC Peace Team have worked with Brendan around the 2020 political violence in the US and around the elections. I would like to invite the 2 of you to now share your experience of involving kind of social media and things like that in this kind of election monitoring. I think, Brendan, you start. Over to you.
Unmute. Thank you, Berit, for that introduction. And I'm very honored to be asked to talk to you all. I think many of you have some pretty impressive experience, possibly more diverse than my own. And I have been perhaps fortunate in that my experience of monitoring and providing remote support has pretty much, well, no, entirely been limited to being quite remote. So before I got involved with this particular project that I'm going to be mainly talking about here, in fact, it was through some experience I had being involved in remote support for election monitoring in Kenya and to a lesser extent in Nigeria in many ways that I came to be involved, and indeed learned a lot from the colleagues and people we worked with in Kenya back over a couple of elections back in 2013, 2017, etc. So in many ways, in this case, I feel like the global north has a debt to the global south in terms of the techniques and the technologies, etc., that we've used. And indeed, I won't actually really speak about it here, but when we first set up this project, we actually did use Ushahidi, which was, of course, developed in Kenya. Right, I'll try and give you a bit of background. I'll see if I can find my, yeah, let's have the correct rather than the wrong presentation. And I'll go to the beginning. Can you all see that?
Yes, we see slides.
Yeah, grand. And remind me, how do I just show the entire slide? Well, not that it really matters a huge amount, but I don't do a lot of slide presentations, it has to be said. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. So as Berit's already kind of alluded to in the introduction, what was originally Election Incident Reporting USA and has since become Political Incident Reporting, because we're no longer simply concentrating on elections. It was set up last year. Really, the original idea was that based on the model that had been used for election monitoring and, contributing to de-escalation or prevention of violence in Kenya, that something along the same lines could be useful for the USA. Now, we fairly quickly ended up going to a somewhat different place, but we set up a team which had initially quite a lot of experienced crisis mappers. And one of the main things that I think we felt, and I felt in particular, was that media monitoring, sometimes I think people tend to underestimate just how, I won't say complicated or even difficult, but it's sometimes a bit of the subordinate part of the whole crisis mapping and remote support world. But actually, I think it's an area that deserves a lot of attention and a lot of serious thought as to exactly how you go about it and how you can best organize your media monitoring so that your verification will, be reasonably effective. And I think some of the old, I'm a pretty gray, both metaphorically and literally, crisis mapper these days. I've been doing various kinds of crisis mapping since at least 2011. But the original kind of crowdsourcing model, I now kind of believe that it doesn't work as well as we maybe thought it did back then. So you're looking for a more bounded kind of media monitoring, where you're really quite deliberate and selective as to what kind of media sources you're monitoring, and that you may zoom in on particular subsets of your overall potential media sources. And on the whole, that people who specialize in generating media rather than people who just happen to be passing by events are likely to be the most effective people to generate the kind of raw material that can then be useful, both in terms of keeping your network informed. And this is one of the things where I should say that for the Trust Network, there is a kind of national level, national US level of lots of different partner organizations. If you go to thetrustnetwork.net, you'll see more about the what exactly the Trust Network consists of. But we're also, of course, and this is maybe what's of most interest to this particular gathering today, where we have people on the ground who may be actively de-escalating violence, interrupting violence, trying to prevent violence through their presence, etc., then of course it's really important that they have the best possible information on what's happening around them. And that's the kind of really targeted kind of monitoring where you have to be very focused and ensure that you're not distracted by stuff that's not really going to be terribly helpful, that you're not, if you're say monitoring something that's happening in DC or Minneapolis or Portland or something like that, then you need to be absolutely focused on those areas and only using sources which are preferably, if at all possible, reporting themselves from the ground in these areas. So this is just a very quick explanation of what we see as our job essentially. And this part, the Signal and Slack, etc., are on the whole the main ways we communicate what we find and what we find that's of useful or importance to the people who may use that information. Again, I won't get bogged down too quickly in the kind of criteria, but we're focusing on physical events largely. I mean, to some extent, we do keep an eye on hate speech, that kind of thing, but it's not really our main area of interest. And yeah, again, incident types, a lot of that's going to be fairly obvious, particularly to, I think, a lot of the people here who have some experience of monitoring violence in various different ways in different parts of the world. So I won't dwell on that particularly. But again, yeah, we therefore decided that we needed to have locally defined Twitter lists. And we decided that Twitter was going to be our first port of call for pretty much all of our monitoring. Now, we may end up then in the course of events finding other social media that we use. So that may be Facebook, that may be Twitch, that may be YouTube, etc. But we have found that the most efficient place to go to find information is Twitter. And we now, Per USA has, actually I've lost count, we've got something like 40, 50, maybe even more different lists now covering every state in the US, although some of the smaller states, I'm afraid, don't get their own list. Rhode Island doesn't have its own list. I apologize to anybody from Rhode Island who may be here. And then areas which may be more of interest to us, such as maybe LA or South California. Again, bits of the Pacific Northwest, which have been quite active in terms of protests and political violence. Again, Minneapolis, they will have dedicated lists. And yeah, again, the kind of people that we actually put in these lists, you see here at the bottom. So it's mainly people who are actually going to be on the ground. So not just your political columnist is of no interest to us, because they ain't going to be out there. They ain't going to be sending any video information of a protest or whatever. But it can, of course, be quite a varied bunch of reporters. I mean, some people, business reporters sometimes seem to volunteer to go out and cover protests, in which case, yeah, we'll absolutely want to have them. And one of the things that's maybe worth emphasizing a wee bit is that one area that has become one of the more important sources of information are various kinds of independent videographers. And I won't go into it in huge depth right now, but they basically, any of you have seen the film The Nightcrawler with Jake Gyllenhaal, where you've got somebody who just goes out when stuff is happening and there are car crashes and stuff like that, and he's trying to get footage and sell that to the networks. Well, that's now, there's a whole kind of sub-ecosystem of such people in the US. Some of them just do it for making money, but some of them do it for more political, more ideological reasons. And they actually can be extremely useful because they are often streaming live. So that's often some of the richest sources of information that we can get. Now, obviously, the more ideological ones, you have to be careful, because you have to be aware that they are often, say, for example, the right-wingers, maybe, if people here know who the Proud Boys are, that's, a militant, violent group from the extreme right wing in the US who have been very closely associated with a lot of the more violent events that we've had in the US over the last year or so. And you may find that the right-wing videographers are filming from over the shoulder of the Proud Boys, for example. And to some extent, you may find that some of the more ideologically far left people may be filming over the shoulders of Black Bloc. I mean, it doesn't quite work like that, but that's one of the things. So yeah. So we use TweetDeck a fair bit, and there's a quick shot there looking at how that be. So you've got, for example, there on the left, you've got We Ground Sources is a list for Wisconsin, and we're paying a lot of attention to Wisconsin at the moment because the Kyle Rittenhouse trial is coming to a verdict, possibly even today. Here's Michigan, here's Minnesota, and so on, and some search terms that were also used. When we're putting stuff into Slack, this is just a very quick example. This is one of the days, in fact, the first day that we worked together with Eli, with DC Peace Team. And this is the kind of stuff that I was putting in the general Slack channel for Trust Network partners. And yeah, how are we doing? So yeah, Eli, do you want to maybe take over at this point? Do you want me to relinquish screen sharing and pass over to you? Or
I think we've got a little more time if you have other pieces you wanted to share.
Yeah, well, I suppose Yeah, what I could say from the remote support provision side is that, and I don't have any screenshots. I'm not very good at putting together presentations, I have to admit. But I mean, Signal is the main way in which we talk to people on the ground. And we found, particularly with DC, but also in some other cases. So for example, there have been elections in Virginia recently. It wasn't ever quite as, the degree of jeopardy wasn't as extreme as it was for the DC peace team volunteers on the ground on, say, the 12th of December and 6th of January, etc. But nonetheless, when the premium is on getting very clear information on what's happening as quickly as possible, as succinctly as possible. So for example, I think DC peace team people say, for example, if they're in somewhere like BLM Plaza in Washington, DC, and they're Proud Boys wandering around, then they need to know, where the Proud Boy groups are, how many there are in these groups, which direction they're moving in, where have they been seen most recently, and do they look as if they're posing a direct threat? So again, one of the things that we have found is that while Slack is fine for posting information, it's the concept of screen space economy is, I think, one that we've come to appreciate, or certainly I've come to appreciate quite a bit. See, again, Slack, you can turn off putting the graphics in there, but it's still a bit wasteful of space. Whereas if you're on the ground, you've got your mobile phone probably, and you don't want, you want to get a decent overview of what's happening and see the messages and not have all the space taken up with graphics, etc. And Signal is simply better at doing that. And again, for exchanging quick, efficient messages back and forth if necessary. So for example, when DC peace team may have a couple of remote people, there may also be some people who are doing a little bit of scouting, and there may be other people who have other particular jobs in terms of helping to ensure that kind of 360-degree awareness as much as possible. Then Signal is pretty efficient at that, whereas Slack is just wasteful. And it does a job, and it for other people who are sitting at home or in their offices or whatever, it's grand. It gives them a bit of an overview, but Signal is by far the most efficient way of getting alerts in our experience, and we found it quite useful again with recent events in Virginia. I mean, fortunately, Virginia didn't turn into anything, partly because, of course, the Republicans won, but there was quite a lot of signs running up to the election in Virginia just a couple of weeks ago that there might well have been violence if it had been a much closer election, for example. And again, we were in a Signal channels with people who were closely monitoring the extreme right on Telegram channels and so on. So again, that ability to have that extra dimension was extremely useful. It's not so relevant perhaps for today's discussion, but I also just show you that we do keep compile reports on events, and it may well be different people who actually compile the reports as to those who are doing the kind of real-time monitoring, and so that can provide the kind of information that will then be used possibly for further analysis. Or, for example, one of our main partners is Bridging Divides Initiative, which is based at Princeton, and they provide a weekly or a fortnightly sort of situation report that they circulate to people who are looking at political violence in the US. And this will provide them, we're one of the sources that they use to give a picture of what's happening across the country, and helps them to illustrate, because again, if you see here, we try and provide as many social media sources. Again, here it will quite often be mixtures of Twitter reports, or posts. Traditional media reports, say from the local newspaper, whether that's the LA Times or the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel or whatever, and then YouTube and Twitch and Facebook videos, etc. So, okay, shall I pass over to you, Eli, now, and I can, come back and happily discuss and answer questions, etc.
Yeah, thanks, Brendan. Yeah, it will be interesting to see what Eli says from the receiving end of things.
Yeah,
I should
exactly.
perhaps mention that you told me you've never been to DC, to Washington DC. So
I've never set foot in the United States.
But you know it, and you give
well, I know it from its maps,
from Google Maps,
aerial
and stuff
photography
like that.
and so on,
So
and Street View. Street View is really useful. I should maybe have said that Street View is a godsend. And I'll actually also maybe just comment that when you don't have Street View, and I have been doing a little bit of it's more informal monitoring for networks that I have in Sudan recently, where I've long-standing relationships. If you don't have Street View, it makes it much more difficult to locate places. But anyway.
Great. Thank you so much, Brendan. Good to see you again. Appreciate all your amazing insight on this. It's just really fascinating, and it's been really helpful. So the partnership we had was during a series of demonstrations towards the end of 2020 related to the presidential elections here in the United States. So they kind of kicked off in October, November, December, and into January. So we were, part of a broader collective of unarmed protection groups and de-escalators that kind of work together with the local organizers who were setting up kind of counter demonstrations to those who were coming into DC, kind of protesting the election results and so forth. So we actually had, as part of that broader coalition, a kind of intel tracking unit, and they would, they were from different organizations around DC, and they were kind of charged with trying to keep track of how many people and where people were at and what was coming down in the press, where the police were, and so forth. So we had a representative from that unit who was assigned to our organization, and they would feed us kind of information that came through there. And then Brendan and Claire also kind of helped kind of focus intel gathering for the DC Peace Team kind of outside of that coalition group. So the ways that it was, particularly helpful, I think, was in general getting a better feel for like situational awareness. You go into those moments and you're not sure what's going to happen. You're not sure what's happening 2 blocks down maybe, or on the other side of town. And are things pretty calm, or is there things ratcheting up that could start coming to where some of the people in the group are located? So just having a clear situational awareness, kind of minimizing some of the unknowns, minimizing some rumors, right, that can get spread kind of on the ground, which may or may not be verified and so forth. The other piece, Brendan kind of alluded to this, is really like identifying pending risk and responses. So the one example is like, the Proud Boys have 30 people, they're moving quickly on 11th and moving up towards Penn Avenue going north, right? So we were like a few blocks away from that. So then we'll send, 2 or 4 people, ahead, or kind of in between groups that we know they could potentially clash with as they're kind of moving down the street. And, it's not just kind of one group. There are multiple kind of marches and demonstrations and potential groups that are looking to get engaged in violence or harm. So we're able to kind of get real-time information on where they're located in the city. We also can get information about police movements, which is pretty critical, right? Because the police have their own sort of intel gathering that they get. And if we hear that, there's a bunch of police vans moving down Constitution towards the White House, then that's going to be a signal to us that we either want to try to get people in that direction or warn people that are already there that, something could be kind of unpacking. We get We can learn about incidents, you know, if weapons are discovered. We've gotten little messages like, you know, a group was found with a gun or with a knife and that kind of thing. So that also helps us kind of strategize on the ground. And then we get a lot of really great updated kind of press reports. Sometimes there's press conferences in the middle of these things and we don't have time to kind of watch that while we're out on the street trying to de-escalate and build empathy and so forth. But we can get the, you know, the brief kind of short nugget that says, you know, this decision maker just said that, and then that becomes relevant for how certain groups on the ground kind of might react in a particular moment. And then another piece is just like large crowd movements with multiple groups. So, you know, like some of the election demonstrations, there were at least 2 or 3 spots where there were demonstrations happening. So we would get intel like, you know, the group at Freedom Plaza is moving towards the Capitol. The other group is moving towards Black Lives Matter Plaza, right? So then that helps us kind of move our folks around and kind of try to be in better position. Just a couple thoughts on like, you know, what could be next with this work? What could be next steps for further developments? I mean, I think one piece which is sort of in place, but could be solidified a little bit more is having on the ground scouts. Sometimes there are people like with bicycles in DC that will ride around and feed intel to the remote folks. I think, you know, groups like DCP's team or other groups like us that are focused on UCP could kind of do that work of having on the ground scouts connected to remote people. So you have sort of intel gathering on the ground, people that are focused on that with people who are focused on it remotely. And that can, I think, provide maybe a tighter kind of communication. The other piece, which I think we're kind of working on back in 2020, I'm not sure, perhaps it's advanced at this point, is like having a real-time kind of map that folks can see on the ground and can be updated with, you know, whether it's a red spot for where a risk is, or you can kind of see a line of kind of a trajectory of where a group is moving. That might be another piece which could be helpful in some contexts. So let me pause there and hand it over to Bert.
Yeah, thank you so much to both of you. That's been really interesting, interesting insights on how kind of technology can actually help us to do some of the accompaniment and protection. I'd like to open the floor to questions and comments, and I'm interested whether anyone else has experience with doing this, for example, or whether you have any specific questions. I have loads, but I'm gonna hold back. I see Mayol with his hand up. Yeah, please use your hand sign, or if you don't want to speak or can't speak, then just also put your question in the chat and I can read it out for you. That's fine too. Mayol, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Hello. Okay. Thanks for those nice presentations. Yes, I would like to stress a similar experience, to stress how valuable all of this intel is, and then go for proposal for cooperation. My experience was mainly at the European Commission Joint Research Center, where I was doing some intel on security issues and human rights violation for the Kimberley Process Certificate Scheme. And we were doing satellite imagery. So each satellite imagery that we ordered, so we tasked the satellite to take the imagery that was between 5,000 and 20,000 euros each image, without the cost of human processing. And we took several images every semester, so they're very expensive. And then undisclosed statistical data from diamond trade. And the last part was intel 100% from open source information from the web, using natural language processing, that is robots that we design and then analysis on this. And guess what? the first part, so without the intel, was classified with such a low level of classification that it would be disseminated to more than 100 country representatives, which we knew that 5 of them would leak that to the press. Okay, but the intel that came from open source data was classified with a high level priority, which meant that only 10 to 30% people in Brussels would read it, and that's all. That is open source data. When you get to manage, I mean, we were collecting tens of thousands of articles every day on our topics and selecting just the 2 or 3 that mattered. It is more valuable than closed data if you process that. And so at that time, we were working with the, I was working with EMM, the Europe Media Monitor, which has an in-house workflow toolchain for doing this work. And then after that, I worked in several NGOs at university, and I got interested into open source products that do the same, that you can fine tune. And my question and proposals, because we've done some experiments with this, is how about what is the product that you use? I guess you might use some natural language processing tools. Are those open source? What would be the interests of the people here to develop together or to improve together those? So for example, myself, I teach database creation on conflict and conflict event and non-violent actions in 5 universities. And so every year I have 150 students helping me annotating this. So trying to build a tool chain so that in the future, robots will instantly be able to collect the right information. So how would you see potential for cooperation on this? Thank you.
Thank you, Mayur. I'll collect a few questions. So if you please take a note, Eli and Brendan, it will remember. Sherry was next.
My question is much more humble. I have a question and then an example to inform my question. My question is, how have the trainings of UCPs, particularly newer ones, changed in order to integrate the use of technology? My question is brought forward by an example where an experienced group of us were out there with walkies, etc., and we're finding that more and more walkie-talkies are being deployed in teams of 2 or 3. But some of the newer peacekeepers didn't have a clue what to do. They carried it around and they were using it more to chat with their friends and, oh, shall we meet after for coffee, etc. And we were not getting the intel we needed, so that we had some very critical situations erupt. So are we integrating effectively, and what kind of technology besides? We're using the simplistic walkie-talkies, but what, I don't have access to satellites. So what kind of technology are you finding effective? And a simple part 2 is Signal effective outside of big cities? We use it all the time, but if I'm in a remote part of Afghanistan or in even a remote part of California, is Signal effective? Can it be used to turn? So I guess I have 2 questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Sherry. It's probably also a wider question of how context specific is, like the use, you mentioned Twitter, for example, and Signal. Is that everywhere, or would it be kind of quite different if you went to Afghanistan or to South Sudan? Christine, please.
Yes, also 2 or 3 questions very quickly. Maybe I just missed it, but how do you verify the information you are gathering? I'm also asking, having in mind that maybe people might, when they learn of your work, might try to use the network to spread false information, or that maybe, be it now police or be it other groups, that they just try to influence the situation by just passing on false information. And Then as to technology, I was also wondering, because I know that at least here in my part of the world, in Europe, the police is using drones for observation. And this, what you are doing, partly seems to me very much like to what police is also doing in demonstrations. So did you also consider the use of drones? Thanks.
Okay, I have one last comment here in the chat, and then I hand back to Brendan and Eli. Jane from Nairobi is saying, or from Kenya is saying, hi, I'm Jane from Kenya. Thank you so much for the presentations. Here in Kenya, an organization called Sisi ni Amani were very instrumental in using cell phone SMS to prevent violence. They had a free number where people would SMS and share information for intervention. And so unfortunately, I don't know, Jane, whether you were here at the beginning. Dennis, who was supposed to be here from this organization, can't make it today because he's sick. Otherwise, we would have heard about the work of this group. But yeah, back to you, Brendan and Eli. Brendan, do you want to go first?
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'll start with Mayul. Is that? I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I mean, the NLP side of things is certainly something that we've looked at, and there are some organizations in the US that are doing that kind of media monitoring, essentially. I mean, there's the Sangani Center at Virginia Tech, and they work with one of our partners, Bridging Divides Initiative. But we have found that, and I must admit, my experience in crisis mapping as well, I'll have to say, wasted a lot of time, in my view anyway, trying to train NLP systems to monitor humanitarian social media, messages, at times of natural disasters, etc. And honestly, I was never terribly happy with them. And of course, the one thing, particularly with the US, and this absolutely will not be transferable to areas where you don't have heavy and granular media coverage of various kinds, is that certainly in the bigger cities, and particularly for the kind of set piece events that Eli and I have collaborated on, we knew in advance that something was going to happen, and the media knew in advance that something was going to happen, and the activists knew in advance that something was going to happen. So, lots of people congregated. In fact, it almost became a problem, as Eli will probably remember as well, because there were so many people there that actually the cell phone towers couldn't cope. So at times, actually, there were people who were trying to stream video and it just wasn't going through because there was just so much stuff trying to go through the mass at the same time. So you have a wealth and almost an embarrassment of riches, relatively speaking. And whereas if something happened in remote Appalachian Georgia or somewhere like that, the kind of methods that we've used would not work as well, because we just simply wouldn't have that kind of coverage. And you would then have to move to something different. Again, I'm not entirely sure that NLP would be that helpful to you, to be honest, but that's the kind of time where you would need to widen your net to use maybe much more human intelligence from people you have on the ground using, cell phones or whatever. And so, yeah, but to come back to the NLP point, I suppose my experience, certainly with the US, and I think it would apply to a lot of Western Europe and, a lot of other places which do have relatively sophisticated communications infrastructure, and where social media and media is present in large volumes, and there's a wide diversity of media, then this kind of, I suppose, we've found that if you do really get to know your local media ecosystem consisting of journalists and activists and so on, then you will be able to have a much better signal to noise ratio than I think you would have if you're trying to sift through fire hoses. I mean, hashtags and stuff like that. I mean, occasionally it can help at the beginning of something, and you might find a few new sources, but generally it's not been very helpful for us. But then again, we're trying to solve a different kind of problem to the kind of issues, and again, a more real-time thing where I think NLP will just be too slow, I think, for a lot of our purposes anyway. Training to reflect tech using walkie-talkies. I mean, walkie-talkies, of course, could be quite important, again, in terms of, where you've got repressive regimes, etc. I mean, we've seen in Sudan just over the last few weeks where the internet's been shut down completely. Some, mobile networks have been largely closed down. So, old technology, walkie-talkies, etc., could be quite useful. And again, for situations in either, rural, remote areas, or even perhaps where you've got so many people, as you had in DC, where maybe the cell phone network isn't working so well, having that kind of belt and braces, walkie-talkie kind of approach could be quite useful. But of course, you have to make sure that the people using it are trained beforehand, as you mentioned. CC Nimani and SMS. That's kind of interesting, and it's somewhere we may actually go back to that. We actually started off using Twilio, which I think you use in Kenya, and I know it's been used in quite a few other places, and it is used to some extent in the US, because the original vision that we had for the Trust Network is that we would have a very extensive ground network of monitors and volunteers. In reality, that didn't quite materialize, and therefore, because of the fact, again, that the media coverage of events was generally pretty dense, we didn't really find that there was that high a value in our acting as a general warning network for the population. It might be that, we might talk to a very, bounded subgroup such as DC Peace Team, or maybe, Nonviolent Peace Force team in Minneapolis or something like that, but and again, some particular Trust Network activists or volunteers, say in somewhere like Virginia. But in general, the kind of wide area SMS system probably didn't really fit what we were trying to do. But we may, when we're trying to cover broader areas where we will actually have, again, a much greater premium on a network of ground monitors, say, for example, where you've got a mix of volunteers from, say, NAACP, SPLC, ADL, etc., some of the, anti-racism, anti-hate, civil rights, etc., kind of organizations in the US, then it may well be that SMS comes back onto the scene as something we consider as a tool that would be appropriate, but it hasn't, for the time being. We put it to one side. And finally, Christine, the verification side, in some ways, I don't want to detain people too long. It is extremely important. We did kind of find that the methodology, if you like, that we used with Uchaguzi in Kenya, etc., that really wasn't quite so appropriate for what we were doing. If we already sort of pre-filtered our sources, and this is where you need media monitors actually who should be, if not exactly full-time, certainly they're people who do this as, essentially, ideally as a job. I mean, we've found it difficult to get sufficient consistent funding, but nonetheless, people who actually are week in, week out, spending time with these, the media in, Portland and Oregon and California and DC and Minneapolis, etc., then they will know. We will develop a kind of our own rankings and assessments of what's accurate and what's not. And again, this is where you need always to have some experienced monitors on hand. So, for example, we're covering what's happening in Kenosha in Wisconsin with the Kyle Rittenhouse trial at the moment. And one of my monitors who hadn't been following things over the previous couple of days, he saw something about somebody, I mean, it's relatively trivial, but somebody dumped Gatorade on, somebody from the other side, pro Rittenhouse, anti Rittenhouse, and he posted a video showing it. But the thing is, we've been monitoring the previous couple of days, and actually somebody was being a bit, I don't know, sloppy, and they hadn't noticed that actually what they'd posted was from the previous day. I mean, that's a minor kind of thing. But again, one of the big things to always watch out for is that there are a lot of aggregators out there, particularly more ideological people who will, they sit at home, and they could be anywhere in the US or indeed Canada, wherever, and they're picking up stuff. They're in effect doing their own monitoring, and then they're pumping stuff out, but often as propaganda, and they are often retweeted a lot, and they tend to turn up in people's feeds. But if your monitors are well trained, then they know that that's not a direct feed from the ground. That's just somebody picking it up, and it may well be inaccurate. Whereas if you've already established through following the events through the course of the day that videographer A and videographer B and videographer C are actually present on the ground, then, and of course they're cross corroborating their from looking at the different feeds and photographs and so on, you're seeing that, yeah, that view it fits what you've seen from another person shooting from the other side of the street. So you keep an eye on that all the time. But just coming in suddenly and looking for hashtag stuff, etc., or whatever, you'll very quickly end up being misled, I think, and that's why that kind of more professional approach to media monitoring, I think, is pretty important. So I think I'll stop there.
Yeah,
drones. Very quickly. I think drones might be problematic in the US and maybe in some other places in highly policed spaces, where I think you may find that law enforcement regards themselves as, Eli made a comment here, I know something about it, maybe somebody else, that they're not that keen on having lots of drones wandering around getting in the way when they're using drones themselves. But I'm not sure. For other circumstances, they may actually be quite useful. They have been very useful in humanitarian crisis mapping, I know that much. So.
Thank you. Is there anything brief, Eli, you would like to add? And then we move on to the next topic, I suggest, because that's just as important, if not more.
Yeah, 2 sentences. Another technology aspect to think about is using earpieces. And we saw that a lot on the ground during these demonstrations, rather than maybe walkie-talkies, because walkie-talkies, you can hear people talk out loud.
Yeah. Sherry, is that an old hand, or was that kind of a reaction to something you heard?
It was a reaction. I think my example overrode my question. My question was, how have trainings changed in order to teach UCPs how to use technology, what is appropriate, etc.? Have trainings at DCP peace teams or others included the use of technology in their trainings currently, and how so?
Okay, can we note that down, and can Eli or somebody from other organizations respond to that in our second round, so that we can move on to the next topic and not kind of lose time for our next speakers? Rosemary, do you want to take over again?
Yes, thank you, Eli, and thank you, Brendan, for such informative session. And you've really created a lot of interest, and something that people used to see like not important. Actually, it's very critical for UCP sustainability. So our next session will look at cyber violence and risk and cybersecurity. And here we'll be understanding the relationship between UCP work and cyber risk and the real world. And our speaker will be, he's called Olive, but we like calling him Liv Williams from Bristol University. And we'll also have the other speaker from Kenya, and that we'll be looking at towards building cybersecurity into all their projects and the way forward. And this is none other than Maina from Protection International Africa. But before we start, I'd just like to give a brief introduction to Liv, who works as a senior cyber and information security consultant at Abache, and she has a background in international emergency response, having been deployed across fragile conflict, violence, and natural disaster affected environments. And our expertise and deep interest in cyber and information, and especially data security, stems from this first-hand experience of this complex and rapidly changing context, and in particular from deployments to the Middle East, Asia, and Africa, where she has led specialist teams to gather and handle sensitive information. So Liv, over to you, and you'll be taking us in this area that even the governments are interested in understanding how to deal with it. Liv.
Thank you very much. And first of all, thank you ever so much for inviting me to take part in today's fantastic event. Heard some really great things already, so I'm hoping that I can do a little bit to contribute to what's already the great stuff that's already been provided today. So what I want to do first is share my screen, which I will do here. So, what can you say? Anything? What can you see?
Yeah, we see a slide.
Yes, you can see it, yes.
Okay, great. So I'm just.
You can put it as a view so that from
what can I
play,
do? Sorry.
From start, from start, yes. There.
Right, here we are. Great,
Yes.
so you can see the whole thing.
Yes.
Good. So I'm just going to try and move this, which isn't going to work. Never mind. Okay. So yes, I just wanted to give you a little bit of my background. So just to inform that introduction a little bit. So I was deployed to various emergency and crisis zones sort of over a 5-year period, working for various NGOs. And during that time, prior to that, I was actually working for the BBC as a researcher and assistant producer, so I was sort of very well versed in, you know, hoisting a camera onto my shoulder and being told to go here, there, and everywhere and capture what was going on any particular day. I was working for the current affairs department, and then I moved into sort of emergency and crisis environments, wanting to use that sort of those media skills in what felt to me anyway like a sort of a more meaningful environment. So yes, I was just deploying for about 5 years, and during that time I was capturing sort of video and photography of beneficiary groups around the world, and also hand in hand with that I was also sort of gathering personal and sensitive data from those beneficiary groups. During that time, it sort of dawned on me more and more, the more I was deploying, that there was never really any conversation about how to secure that data. And it became more and more uncomfortable as I deployed more, that conversation wasn't happening. So I then took some time out to pursue a PhD to try and uncover what exactly was going on the ground and what exactly the problem was. How much was data being secured? How much was that data highly sought after by governments, intelligence agencies, other NGOs, other beneficiary groups, that kind of thing. So what I wanted to do today is just run you through some of the findings that I was able to gather from that 3-year PhD study that was completed last year. So it's sort of hot off the press, if you like. So just checking you can all still hear me.
Yes, we can.
That's good. Okay, good. So these are probably quite common images. You know, those of us who've deployed and those of us who've been working for NGOs and have certainly had images like this across our desks. You know, it's all fantastic stuff. You're going into a country and you're collecting data so that you can produce vulnerability assessments, gathering data to share with other organizations so that you can primarily identify who needs help first, and then how to prioritize the list of beneficiaries. So you can see here there's a sort of a good assortment of ways in which beneficiary data is captured. Some of it's biometric, some of it's the good old, you know, pen and paper, some of it's using tablets and other kinds of digital devices being taken into the field. excuse me, and that's all absolutely fantastic stuff, and it really, really helps get us information about what's going on the ground very, very quickly. And that information can then be disseminated. So it's really, really fantastic that technology is being used. But my focus for this project was to really better understand what was going on, or what is going on in the field versus what NGOs say is going on in the field. So to do that, I was asking questions like, what do NGOs say that they do to protect the beneficiary data that they collect versus what do aid workers, who are obviously boots on the ground in the field, say that they do to protect the beneficiary data that they collect? And then based upon the findings of those two questions, what are the sort of harms that might befall the beneficiary in real world terms? So to do that, I had to find some case studies. And because I was most well versed myself, personally speaking, in sort of emergent UN cluster system and emergency contexts, I sort of took that cluster system and all of the organizations that worked within under that cluster. So there's 11 different sort of subject areas under the cluster system. There were 193 organizations in 2019-2020 working under that cluster system. I then wanted to streamline the organizations I was looking at. Obviously, a single person looking at 193 organizations is quite a hard task. So I then identified the ones that self-identify as NGO. Then I asked of those ones which collect beneficiary data. Then based upon the sort of the smaller number I had of those, I made a priority list of most active to least active. And then I was able to cross-check those with document availability. So when I mean document, I mean, data security policies, how they incorporate GDPR or HIPAA type legislation into their policies. Some of them were able to provide me with cybersecurity policies, etc., data handling, that kind of thing. So that whittled it down to about 10 organizations. But I'm not going to go into exactly what those documents found, because that was the content analysis portion of my study. I think it's actually much more interesting for today's purposes to look at what aid workers themselves found or share their opinions with you. Because it was really illuminating to me, actually, having been an aid worker for several years myself. So the e-survey, findings from the e-survey that I'm about to share with you, I hosted the electronic survey that I designed myself on 50 Shades of Aid, that I think a lot of you may be familiar with. It's a Facebook page that allows aid workers to come together from across the globe, ask questions, share information, ask for advice, that kind of thing. And they've got thousands and thousands and thousands of subscribers to that page. So I hosted my electronic survey on 50 Shades of Aid with their permission. So here are some of the findings. So the Austin, sorry, are you able to tell me how I can move I've got mute, stop video, security, etc. Are you able to tell me how I can move that down to elsewhere on my page, on my screen?
Austin, did you hear? Yeah.
Because it's right in the middle of my screen at the moment, which is less than ideal. If anyone can share with me how I move that. Oh,
you should be able to click and kind of drag it around. We can't see it, only you can.
That's it, done it. Thank you so much. Makes things a lot easier. Fantastic. So the participant demographics, they were many people responded, nationalities spanning 28 countries from North and South America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and Oceania. People from about 5 different ages responded, with the greatest number of participants between 35 and 44. The greatest number of participants had worked in the sector for between 6 and 10 years. And then 86 participants indicated that they had worked for at least one of the 10 case study NGOs that I had studied in the previous content analysis portion of my study. And participants also named an additional 81 NGOs that they had worked for. So if all of a sudden, the data that I was gathering went far, far beyond those 10 NGOs that I'd honed in on earlier. And I was gathering information from people who worked across a really, really wide spectrum of the NGO, emergency NGO community. So a significant number of aid workers, when I asked them about their data handling experiences, said that they used their own devices to collect, process and share beneficiary data, and that they had not been instructed by their NGO not to do so. So it's probably worth mentioning here that a lot of the points that I've got on screen here are directly relevant to some of the threats that we might find in the cyber and information security arena. So we can come on to that a little bit later. So just keep that in mind as we go through some of these findings.
Liv, can I just speed you up a bit, because we're kind of running out of time, sorry.
Yeah, no problem. No problem, I'll go. How long do we have left?
2 minutes.
Okay, that's fine, we'll speed through. Hold on to your horses, people, let's go. Devices and papers containing beneficiary and personal data were kept in locations where unauthorized persons could access them. AV equipment was hidden, but it was not digitally protected, whereas devices that did have a password or a PIN were hidden in physical locations, as well as using those passwords. Email was the most common means of sharing beneficiary data, but the physical handover of beneficiary files or USB sticks and use of messaging apps and phone calls to share data were also very common. Some aid workers were confident, they said, in limiting access to data, and aid workers fundamentally trusted that partners were doing what they had been asked to do to protect data, rather than sort of double checking by some other means. Well, let's just pick out a few things here since we're so limited in time. So when I asked aid workers about their opinion on whether it was important to protect data, they said that they thought it was important to collect it, to protect it during collection and dissemination, so sharing that data, but not so much during processing. And given that processing is one of the larger activities when it comes to data handling, that was slightly troubling. The data protection training of aid workers, which sort of links back to a question I think that was asked earlier, was irregular, they said, with a high number of those who had received training saying that it was inadequate and not fit for purpose. And one of the fundamental things that we found in this study was that even though aid workers, who I like to call sort of frontline experts, had all this experience with regards to data handling in these emergency environments, many aid workers said that they never received a debrief. And the majority of those who had received a debrief within the past 5 years expressed that they'd never been asked about their data handling experiences. And given that their on the ground practices and their experiences can directly link us back to some of the potential areas of exploitation and vulnerability when it comes to beneficiary data, that's quite perturbing. So
okay, 1 minute.
Thank you. So yes, as you can see, there's quite a few findings that I was able to gather directly from the community. Going back to here, aid workers who had shared beneficiary data had almost all shared a photograph of a beneficiary's face, and a smaller number had posted video and audio recordings of beneficiaries too. So obviously, I think it's important to say that as part and parcel of being an NGO, it's important to share examples of the work that we're doing, and also share beneficiary information to a certain degree to encourage donors to contribute to the goings on in the field. But also what I found was that very, very few beneficiaries were ever really informed as to what their personal and their biometric information was being used to do. And of course, once it's out in the public domain, it's very, very difficult for beneficiaries particularly to sort of to pull their own information back, as we all find. So that's perturbing as well, and that needs to be dealt with. So I'm not going to go through the interview findings. I just want to finish on this data harm wheel. So one of the things that the recommendations that I made to the sector was, and that I found from interviewing aid workers and experts and looking at some of the the NGO documentation, was that this wheel is very rarely completed in NGO environments. So NGOs very rarely identify who their threat actors are, very rarely identify what the threats that are posed by those threat actors are, the risk of those threats occurring to their NGOs and therefore their beneficiaries, and then real world harms resulting from those threats being realized. So my passing kind of recommendation is that if this sort of data harm wheel can be incorporated into your data security processes and thinking, then that will go a really long way to identifying at the very least where some of the risks and threats might be emanating from in your environments.
Thank you, Liv, for such great and rich presentation with really great findings. And I'm sure there are questions coming, and sorry to have rushed you.
No problem.
Know, yes, so if you have questions, please either write them on chat or raise, just hold until we come to question and discussion. So this time I'd like to give it to Sam, who is going to actually give us his experience on how he has been able to use digital security needs for 3 human rights defenders organizations in Tanzania and also DR Congo, and how he's been able to provide them with long-term accompaniment to build their respective system, resilience, and digital security practice. So Sam, the floor is yours, 10 minutes, and because I know there'll be so many questions, so that we can be able to have such interactive discussion. Thank you.
So I was hoping I could, hello everyone. Yeah, I was hoping I could be able to share my screen, but I'm kind of disabled.
I'm sure
so I'm a participant, I don't know why.
You can be allowed to share. Can you try?
No, disabled.
Austin, can some share the screen? Sam, go ahead.
Okay, if I can share, so it should be like that. What I'm going to be to talk about in this few minutes is how can we build, or what are the kind of suggestions that we can make so that we can build cybersecurity into all our projects. And I think, as all the other speakers have said, and especially Olivia, that there are already risks in the work that they do, especially to data collected and information that is generated, and a lot of the people who work in this space in UCP, they collect data, and they generate reports, or they generate some sort of information that they either store, keep to use for their own decision making, or they share with others. So it depends on the purpose for which this data and this information is collected and information is generated. So if we want to build cybersecurity into our projects, when we have to look at, first of all, we look at what are the initial considerations for being able to do that. And I think first, in the initial considerations, you you have to think of cybersecurity as part of information security. They are not the same thing because information security also involves information that is not in cyberspace or is not in digital format. We also have papers, and also we have conversations over coffee or something. So the cybersecurity is part of that. For us to, when we think that way, we know that IT solutions or the solutions that we develop or take to solve or to address cybersecurity risks will be ineffective if that information can already be leaked by other means, maybe by somebody eavesdropping from eavesdropping from your conversations, or you without knowledge or without unknowingly sharing that information with people who or entities who do not who can cause that threat to the community you're serving, or the volunteers you're working with, or even your own organization. Second thing you need to do and to consider is that risk analysis and mapping is key when it comes to integrating cybersecurity into your UCP projects. So to build cybersecurity in your projects, you will need to analyze what are the risks that the data is facing, and the information that you have is facing. They can be the digital risks, and also the risk to that information, and also physical risk, like in-person harm that can happen to a person, a community member, or a volunteer that you're working with, emanating from this cybersecurity digital risk kind of thing. Another thing you need to consider is that even when you approach, when you want to build cybersecurity into your program, your projects, you have to take an approach of sort of like systems change kind of approach. And inbuilt in that kind of system change means that people have to change behavior. So behavior change is critical for you to focus on when you are building this, and then so that you can be able to protect data and also try to reduce physical risks that may happen to communities, community members, to victims, and also to volunteers and staff. Technology solutions will be ineffective if they are not used. If people don't form a habit of using these solutions that maybe the cybersecurity experts propose, then there will be there's likely not to be no change in terms of in terms of the level of risk. And lastly, in the initial considerations, you need to, it is very important to have an in-house IT support person or a focal point who is well trained in order to be able to at least manage the cybersecurity integration into your projects. So, and also having this kind of person or persons enables you to have shorter feedback loops in terms of getting feedback from how the experiences that the users are having when you deploy technologies that protect data and information. And also you get quicker response also. For the user, gets quicker response from the IT support person, or the focal point, security focal point. And also there's being there, these persons can help in continuous monitoring of how you are handling data and how and information, and how you are protecting this data and information. So once you have those, you consider those things, you can then build cybersecurity into projects. And if you want to do this, you have to start at the organizational level. And most important, and this is something that we have done at Protection International level, both in the global offices, all the offices around the world, and even in Africa. We recommend that you can conduct an organization-wide cybersecurity risk assessment to know what kind of risk do you face, who are the sources of this the threats that contribute to this risk, and how and what are their capabilities, what are the resources that they have to maybe attack your data or cause physical harm by accessing your data. So we also have to, once we know what the risks are, then we are able to select the productivity and security tools and services that we can use in order to stay more secure or to secure the same our corner of the cyberspace, and also, of course, secure also the people that we work with, the communities and everything. So security tools depends on what you want. It could be you want to maybe secure your devices. So maybe firewalls, you need the firewall, you need the antivirus applications, you need communication tools for productivity, communication tools that are secure, email, maybe chat, or we had that some people use Signal. So sometimes we could use also, apart from Signal, we could use Wire, which is not, does not depend on how you have a mobile phone number or a phone number. So you can just use an email address. Of course, after you've selected that, or as you do that, you could be developing a cybersecurity plan. And this works better if it is integrated into the overall organizational security plan and, of course, reviewed regularly. When you have, like you said, even from the initial consideration, that means you need to have a cybersecurity expert or a well-trained focal point to drive the implementation of the plan that you develop for this. And of course, the most important thing in order to achieve behavioral change is to train the staff and volunteers and perhaps even communities that you work with on cybersecurity awareness, and also being able to respond to, and also perhaps even prevent cybersecurity incidences that you have already identified from your risk assessment.
Thank you. So, are you finished? All right.
Yes. Yes. I'm at the very, very end. Okay. Yes. So as you build your cybersecurity into your projects, and when we now move from the organizational level to project level, you have to include cybersecurity in the initial stage of the project design, so that it is not plugged in later on or trying to hammer it onto an already complete project design. Make sure that it is integrated. So you will need cybersecurity experts or focal points to be involved in the project design phase, because they can help you identify potential risks and solutions, potential risks and the solutions to these risks that you might face. And of course, you have to design also cybersecurity activities into the projects and add them into the project planning matrix, so that, for instance, you can include training of communities and volunteers of the people that you're working with in the UCP work. You can also budget for procurement of implementation, budget for procurement and implementation of these security solutions. And finally, during project implementation, you will need to follow your plans so that you can procure specific cybersecurity solutions that you have identified that will be able to solve the problems or to keep the data safe, for instance. And this could include the communication tools I've talked about, maybe servers and the host of information. If you are storing information in the cloud, you look at what are the policies in the countries that you want your servers to be, so that you see, can governments or strong individuals, corporates force your host to give them information. Of course, then you have to train the volunteers, and you can have workshops for that, or you can do, and then you need follow-up activities that enable you to continue with the process of changing the behavior, so that the volunteers, the partners, the staff, the communities are using the knowledge, the skills, and the tactics and the tools that you have agreed together are the ones that are going to help you in managing cybersecurity for your project. And yes, so very important, if I may repeat, make sure that behavior change remains one of the key considerations for you to, in order to keep cybersecurity. For example, at Protection International, we have discussions that on wire groups, where we discuss all about digital security, the threats that are emerging, and so for your project, you can keep the cybersecurity conversations going by having such kind of spaces where people can discuss cybersecurity.
Thank you, Sam, for such rich and eloquent presentation. And I'm seeing hands are already up, and you raised how organizations need to look at cybersecurity in a more comprehensive manner, and how to deal with it, and how to budget and plan for it, and also how to actually skill build and behavior changes come really critical, from the planning to execution and even to addressing and monitoring. So I'll start. Please feel free to ask questions, and if you can also add your experience in UCP accompaniment tools, and also if you have also got ideas, feel free to put to the chat, and I'll ask by giving an opportunity to Barrett. And remember, this session is a question and answer for both Sam and Olive. So Olive is here, really willing to address your question, and Sam, thank you. Professor Barrett.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to say apologies to Sam, as you will not have seen because you were talking. We lost the controls of over the Zoom meeting, and that's why Austin couldn't make you a co-host, so you couldn't share. Ironically, as we were talking about the dangers and threats of technologies, the technology failed. But since I can share my screen, no, I can't. But what I just wanted to say, what Sam was talking about, there's a lot of materials that Sam and his two colleagues at Protection International put into the Lumio discussion subgroup. There's one that's called UCP in the Digital Age. And there are lots of links of very useful resources from the kind of threat assessment that he was talking about, that should happen at the beginning, not as an afterthought, to the different pages where you can get very practical information and also help on how to think about IT security and data security and so on. And I think was very important what Sam said. I mean, I see this in my own work quite often. This is an afterthought, but it shouldn't be hammered onto existing projects, but maybe thought about from the beginning. So thank you so much, Sam, for raising this. And people here also suggested maybe we can share your presentation on Lumio, as we couldn't see it here, so they can have a look. Sorry about that.
Yeah, it's fine.
Thanks, Professor. Yes, Sam. Yeah. As maybe react to Professor's question, I also have a question. How about the decision for data storage, and also security be looked into the way we store our data and how it's stored and what platform is being used? And to Olive also, I'd like to look into especially skills. Skills keeps on coming, whether the NGOs you're working with had idea of the importance of the resources they were covering from the ground and how they were storing it. Thank you. We can
Yes.
come up with various questions so that they can. Any other question? Hello?
I just wondered if I may, if Liv, among your sample, there was any UCP, any particular unarmed civilian protection group. If so, you don't have to name them, but that was my question, or whether it was more humanitarian organizations in general.
Thank you for the question. Yes, it was, I would say it's more general emergency humanitarian response organizations, but there definitely was at least one sort of NCP group, yes. So it's, I mean, I would say my findings are relevant to not only sort of the emergency response organizations, but also international development. I know that, you know, you talk about humanitarianism or humanitarian organizations as two sort of slightly separate entities, separate from international development, but actually there was a lot of overarching cross-pollination between the organizations who I looked at and who I had responses from, who had sort of an emergency arm, even if they were more sort of longer term assistance type organizations.
Sam, would you like to respond to some of the questions raised by Professor Barrett and also myself in line of security on data storage and on cyber attack?
Yeah, I don't know if Barrett had a question, or maybe I didn't hear that, but yes, I would be able to. One of the things that I picked is that whether we can upload the presentation on Lumio. Yes, we can do that. And I also have my friend here, my colleague Klaus is here. So Klaus, if you feel like jumping in at any time, please go ahead. But when it comes to data storage, and I think this is something that Klaus implements a lot, leads the implementation of, let's say, storage of data and information in our organization. And when it comes to storage of data and information, of course, for PI, we start with security, and then we look at availability and affordability and things like that, so that we know that the data is there, is secure, it is available, and it can be accessed by those who are supposed to access it, or who have authority to access it. And Klaus will add to that. In terms of skills and security management for security management or cyber security management, the skill levels are a bit low among those who implement, let's say, all sort of human rights or UCP work, emergency protection and things like that. They are a bit low. Knowledge is also a bit low from our experience here with the organizations, the partners that we've worked with, and therefore Protection International itself has always built digital security onto all the projects that they implement, such that we have trainings, we have training workshops with the partners, we have training workshops with the communities that we work with, probably human rights defenders in the environment space or in the LGBT space, in all sorts of gender and identity spaces. So we build this here to keep on increasing awareness on how to manage security and to manage security yourself as a human rights defender or as a worker in this space, the UCP space. So that is something we are trying to address, and of course we need more people to help in reaching out to more and more people, so that we get more skills, more knowledge, and more better understanding of tactics and application of tactics for self-protection when it comes to digital space activities. Klaus, if you have a thing or two, you could, if you don't mind, bear it and Rosemary?
Yeah, maybe as last word, Klaus.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Sam. Well, I think from my side, I don't have a lot to add. I think Sam already said it pretty well. If there are specific questions, maybe I can try to add something. But thanks everybody for participating and also in the forum. That was, I think, a great discussion.
Yeah, just to say, I think Klaus and Sam and their colleague Arturo will still be there today in the Lumio discussion board. So to answer very specific questions you might have, which may not fit this session here, so about specific software or very specific problems, and you can post your questions there and they will answer them. And I've posted here the link to that subgroup. So it's the subgroup UCP in the Digital Age, where you find all these materials and all these very useful links, which will be there. But the three of them will be there today still to answer specific questions. So take this opportunity. I know that it's quite often very daunting, especially if we're not very tech savvy, to think about all these things. But I think what this session has shown is how useful technologies can be, but also how many kind of risks there are involved in it, especially if we're not trained or not aware. And these risks, as Liv has said, are not just risks online of data, but they're actual harm to physical people in the world in the worst case. So I think it's quite important to deal with these questions, which were always an afterthought, by the way, in our regional workshops as well, which is why we wanted a session on this here to kind of raise a bit of awareness around this. I fear our time is up. Rosemary, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, actually, I wanted to invite you to do what we call our closing remarks, but I felt that Mel could have brought us his experiences on UCP and accompaniment, especially in South Sudan, and how some of the issues raised by Olivia and Sam is really relevant. Then you take over for our closing remark, Professor.
So did you, I didn't quite, you were breaking up on my computer, sorry. So who did you give the word?
No, I was saying that Mel could actually give us his personal experiences when it comes to UCP and accompaniment, in line with what Sam and Olivia has just presented, and then you take over for closing remarks.
Thank you, Rosemary. I'll pass on that and post relevant information on the Lumio thread.
In that case, thank you very much to all our speakers, and sorry for a slightly chaotic Zoom session. Please take the conversation to Lumio and have a look at the information there. I hope Liv is willing to also share her slides so we can look at it in a bit more, kind of with a bit more time. And she has already posted her email address there, which we might also have on the slides then, so you can actually contact her. The same goes for Klaus and Sam, who will be there, and you know Eli and Brendan now as well, who will be probably able to share more information if you would like to. So thank you so much. I think this is something we need to keep discussing, and the next session is already in 20 minutes, so I think we have to vacate the room. Thank you so much to everyone for this session, and see you soon.
Thank you, everyone. And
thank you all. Good to see you all. Bye.
Thank you.